Good evening. I'm Elizabeth Farnsworth in Washington.
And I'm Robert MacNeil in New York. After tonight's news summary, we discuss the nationwide terrorism alert following the bombing conspiracy verdicts against 10 Muslim militants in New York. Next, Paul Salmon reports on economist Robert Putnam's efforts to rediscover community spirit. Then, trying to understand the proposed changes in Medicare, two reporters explain the real differences between the different proposals.
Anti-terrorism procedures were imposed today at most of the nation's airports. Precautions against possible terrorist attacks are at their highest level since the Persian Gulf War. Police are checking identification and baggage, creating long lines of passengers. Motorists are being warned that unattended cars may be towed. The high-level security alert follows the conviction yesterday of a group of militant Muslims on charges of plotting to blow up several targets in New York. Presidential spokesman Mike McCurry said last week's Middle East peace ceremony in Washington also prompted a review of safety measures. And security has been stepped up at the White House. Part of Pennsylvania Avenue in front of the executive mansion has been closed to pedestrians. The street was closed to vehicle traffic last April following the bombing in Oklahoma City. Dozens of Jewish settlers blocked the border crossing between Israel and Jordan today. They were protesting the Israeli PLO agreement signed last week that increases Palestinian autonomy in the West Bank. The demonstrators broke through Israeli army barricades and waded across the Jordan River into Jordan. Most of them live in the areas affected by the accord.
Still ahead, the new terrorism alert, the new guru of community life, and understanding Medicare reform. Up first, the impact of yesterday's guilty verdict in the New York bomb conspiracy trial. After a 9-month trial and 7 days for deliberation, a federal jury in Manhattan convicted the 10 defendants of plotting a war of urban terrorism. Among the defendants, Egyptian Sheikh Omar Abdel Rahman, the blind cleric who prosecutors contended was the mastermind behind the conspiracy. Within hours of the verdict, Transportation Secretary Federico Peña ordered tighter security measures at all domestic airports. We get more on the ramifications of the verdict from James Kallstrom, New York FBI Director, Larry Johnson, a former official with the State Department's Office of Counterterrorism, he's now a security consultant, and Nihad Awad, Executive Director of the Council on American Islamic Relations. Mr. Kallstrom, besides what's going on at the airports, what other heightened security measures can you describe for us?
Well, we have quite a month coming up in New York City. We have the Pope coming in a few days. We have the largest contingent of world leaders meeting here at the end of the month, about 140 to 150. There's a lot of chaos in the world.
That's for the 50th anniversary of the United Nations.
That's for the 50th anniversary of the United Nations. And there's a lot of chaos in the world, and of course, with the bombing of the World Trade Center and the bombing in Oklahoma City, the gas attack in Tokyo, the rules have changed in this business.
Well, then why was all this suddenly announced right after the verdict in New York yesterday?
Well, I can't speak for the rest of the government. We provide information. What the other agencies decide to do based on that is their best guess at what's right for their system.
Mr. Johnson, what would you suppose was the reason why the government acted now with all these various reasons, as we've just heard from Mr. Kallstrom? Why was this prompted by the verdicts in the New York trial, would you suppose?
It wasn't prompted by the verdict per se. This was a decision that the FAA took really in the summer. They've looked at the existing law.
That's the Federal Aviation Administration.
Yes, the Federal Aviation Administration. There's a two-tiered system of aviation security in this country. What exists internationally is pretty good and pretty tight. What exists domestically is, frankly, very vulnerable. And the FAA recognized this in the wake of Oklahoma City bombing and some other incidents, and they recognized they needed to start tightening up that disparity. And so this is actually, I think, part of a trend that you're going to see continue into next year, where ultimately the domestic security and the international security will be seamless. It will be one system instead of two systems.
Well, are you suggesting that the Transportation Secretary's announcement yesterday, a few hours after that verdict in the trial in New York against the verdicts against 10 Muslim militants, was that was unconnected?
It really was unconnected. The planning has taken into account the fact that, as Agent Kallstrom pointed out, You were going to have the verdict in the trial in October. They also anticipate the extradition of Abu Marzouk, who is the money man for Hamas. He is currently in the custody of U.S. officials. The government of Israel has requested his extradition. You have the Pope's visit. You have the UN General Assembly. Next year you have the Olympics. The fact of the matter is the United States cannot afford an aviation security system which leaves the domestic market unprotected.
Mr. Awad, how do you feel as an American Muslim leader having this all these new security arrangements announced right after the trial verdict in New York?
Well, first of all, as security measures that have to be tightened whenever any act of violence takes place against civilians, we are for that. My serious concern about the timing of this security alert is that it will target the Muslim community. The Muslim community, because Muslim ladies are mainly dressed distinctively, and the Muslim men who especially come from the Middle East have special looks. And our past has told us that whenever these security alerts or whenever these incidents of terrorism take place, and if they are associated with Muslim individuals, then the Muslim community as a whole becomes on trial, but not these few individuals by themselves.
What kinds of things have been happening?
I think maybe the best example to cite is Oklahoma. Right after the Oklahoma bombing took place, within minutes, fingers were pointed out against the Muslim community or Middle Eastern, looking people. And then this violence took off against mosques, Muslim individuals. Muslim homes have been attacked. One graphic incident in our minds is the Muslim lady in Oklahoma, who her house was attacked by unknown people just right one day after the Oklahoma bombing, and she miscarried a near-term baby. That example reminds us of these unnecessary media hype and timing. I think if we are to secure borders, if we are to reinforce tighten security, it should be done irrelevant of the verdict or incidents that have to deal with the Middle East, which unfortunately has been the case. Whenever a Middle Eastern incident takes place or any incident of hate crime or crime is associated to individual Muslims, we see Muslim names on the front pages on the newspapers.
How are Muslims reacting to all this who live in this country? Are more American Muslims abandoning traditional dress or trying to blend into the landscape so that they won't be so visible?
Actually, this is a good question, because during the Oklahoma bombing crisis, many ladies decided to take off the Muslim scarf because it would be easier for them so that they won't be singled out. So I think there's a sense of alienation and anxiety within the community that we try to cope with it. We ask the community to not to ignore any incident of harassment or hate crimes and to report it to the authorities and to us. The result of the survey that we sent after Oklahoma bombing was more than 200 incidents of stereotyping, harassment, and hate crime incidents that took place nationwide, irrespective of the state. So that really highlighted a very serious and dramatic escalation of hate and prejudice against the Muslim community, which I believe some so-called experts on the subject or some maybe irresponsible media reports are responsible for these incidents.
How do you feel as law enforcement official? There are millions of Islamic adherents who are now Americans who live in this country, and yet it's difficult to separate cause and effect in these things.
Well, we think those incidents are very unfortunate. As we in the FBI and know the great majority of Muslims are peace-loving, have nothing to do with not only the rhetoric, but nothing to do with the overt acts. So we condemn those types of events, obviously.
Mr. Johnson, in now heightening security, who are the federal authorities worried about?
Well, let's first make the point that I think Mr. Awad is going to the heart of the matter. Blaming the Islamic community for Sheikh Rahman would be like blaming the Jewish community for Meir Kahane, who was a radical leader, or blaming the Christian community for David Koresh. You have individuals which represent really very small minorities. There are some threats in the world right now that do emanate from some radical extremists. Al-Gama, the organization headed by Sheikh Rahman, has carried out a lot of attacks against foreigners and against Americans in Egypt. Fortunately, they've not carried out any attacks in this country. The message I think the FAA is really trying to send with these security measures, although it coincides with the verdict in the trial, it is saying we have to look at aviation security as a national defense issue. It can't be linked to specific threats. We don't have a threat approach to aviation security when it comes to hijackings. We don't say there's an 80% chance of hijackings next year. We put measures in place to prevent that. Right now, there are not the comparable measures in place to prevent bombings. The FAA is moving in that direction. It's unfortunate if it is somehow assumed that this is the result of Muslim activities, because this has nothing to do with Islam. This has all to do with the activities of Sheikh Rahman, who is a radical leader of a very small group, but a very violent group.
Does, Mr. Johnson, Mr. Kallstrom, does the FBI, have you been alerted to expect that there might be some retaliation by followers of Sheikh Rahman to this verdict?
Well, you know, we knew there'd be a verdict. We knew it would come around the time of the Pope's visit. So we planned it into our planning. We get lots of calls and letters. We get lots of different threats.
Have there been specific threats?
Not specific threats, but we do get a lot of threat information, as you can imagine. Our job is to really analyze that and decide where to put the scarce resources we have in law enforcement.
The FBI, which broke this conspiracy that has been tried for the last 9 months in New York, and previous to that, the bombing of the World Trade Center, you obviously had a lot of people under surveillance at the time. Are there still a great many people who might be described as Muslim militants who are considered a threat and who are being watched in this country?
I'm not going to say Muslim militants. I'm going to say there are a lot of people that we are concerned about. And us in Secret Service are working, and the New York City Police Department are working diligently on that. I think the lesson of this trial, the lesson of this verdict yesterday, was that law enforcement must look ahead. It's a different time. The rules have changed, and we must have a focus and a vision, and we must make sure that we have the tools to do our job.
Mr. Johnson, how much can you add to that about the people who are under surveillance by various law enforcement agencies who are considered a threat of this kind?
The overall threat level in the United States is still relatively low. The number of groups that are out there advocating violence, they've shrunk over the last 10 years. You don't have the number of state sponsors that you once did. So I think it's very important that we not become alarmists, that we not start hitting the panic button, and then we not start blaming people using guilt by association. I would disagree with Agent Kallstrom in that the rules have changed. The rules have not changed. The rules are very clear. The United States has the ability to take proactive measures that can deter and stop terrorists. That's what's being done in this case of the aviation procedures. I think there are prudent measures that can be taken in a variety of areas. It is important that in taking those measures, though, we differentiate between what the real threat is, and we don't assign blame to a group of people. Because by and large, the Islamic community is the same as the Jewish community and the Christian community. They're people of very deep religious beliefs, sincere beliefs, and committed to peace.
Mr. Awad, do you want the federal government, whatever organ it is, to do more than it is doing to make the statements that we've just heard from Mr. Kallstrom and Mr. Johnson?
Well, first of all, no one in a position to say to the government what to do and what not to do, but I'm very sure about one thing, that unfortunately we judge our concerns on the facts at hand, and the statistics do not support this wild theory that there are people, are out there to get us and so on. And when people talk about this theory, sometimes they would go at the end and say a little disclaimer that the Muslim community as a whole is a peace-loving community, but unfortunately we have these people. Or when you read a long article in the newspaper...
That's true, though, isn't it?
What's that?
It is true that there are some people witness the verdicts that have been just handed down in New York.
Yeah, it is correct, but these little disclaimers that come too late most often, and at the end of a long statement or at the end of a long article that says Muslims, 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 then these disclaimers do very little to ensure the fact that Muslims are not on trial as a whole, or the Muslim community is not guilty, by these acts. And whenever we hear that sometimes that Muslims are not being singled out, I really disagree with that a lot, because most of the incidents that have been reported are from those who are innocent. And most of these incidents that we documented, which amounted more than 250 by today, come from people who are traveling on daily basis in the airports or do just normal business, and they are the prime people to be targeted.
Okay. Let me just ask Mr. Johnson, Mr. Kallstrom, finally. You said, Mr. Johnson, once these, the UN anniversary and the Pope's visit and everything are over, that these measures are going to continue.
Yes, the aviation security issues are entirely separate from
it's
the
going to
threat.
become regular within domestic flying in this country, that it will be as difficult to get on a plane as it is to go abroad?
Yes, that's where it's headed. Now, there's a debate raging in the airline industry, and that's probably a different topic for a different show, but my belief is that what you're going to see is these measures will stay in place, and it's part of a much-needed closing of a gap between international security procedures and domestic security procedures.
Do you have an observation on that from the FBI's point of view? We're probably headed for a time when this will just become routine, this extra.
I think we are headed for a time. I think it'll start off selectively in selective places, and hopefully the procedures will be such that they won't encumber the public to the extent they do when they're first put in.
Well, gentlemen, all of you.